Hi, and welcome to this introduction to mindfulness. My name is Matt Moyer, and I am hoping to share with you a definition of mindfulness, our purpose, why we might be interested in it in schools, and some research and some experience to help back that up. Hopefully, this will serve as a good introduction to parents, to fellow teachers, and to school administrators who might be interested in learning a little bit more about mindfulness. So, just quickly about me, this is my 19th year as an educator. I'm currently a doctoral student, and one of my interests in research is contemplative education, of which mindfulness practices would be considered, among many. I'm also a graduate of a program developed by Mindful Schools, a group that has designed programs for specifically with schools in mind for implementing mindfulness-based interventions. I've taken two of their courses. The first, Mindfulness Fundamentals, was just simply about mindfulness, but Mindful Educator Essentials, the second course, was about implementing these particular kinds of interventions and using a particular curriculum. Mindfulness is also part of my personal practice. I enjoy getting up in the morning and doing yoga and meditation. So there are lots of formal and informal practices that I enjoy in my everyday life. So that gives you at least a little bit of an idea of about where I'm coming from. First off, what is mindfulness? Well, if you've read anything about mindfulness, probably the name John Kabat-Zinn comes to mind. His definition, often quoted, is mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So there's three things: on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally are kind of the hallmarks. Said another way, it's about concentration power, being able to pay attention. It's about using our senses and picking up what's going on in the present moment, using all five senses, being very embodied and aware of what's going on. And finally, being balanced, or the fancy word is equanimity, having equanimity. And that includes being accepting of whatever it is might be happening at that particular moment, not labeling it, you might say. Sometimes people use mindfulness as a way of describing a state of being, maybe as a trait or as a practice. So you can use mindfulness in some of those different ways. You might just say very quickly, and a definition I would use with students is that mindfulness is noticing what is happening right now. Other words like concentration or attention kind of come to mind, but the mindful schools trainers also kind of gave this analogy of a bird, and a bird needs two wings. And so while concentration and attention is one of those wings, the other wing is the impulse control or emotional regulation, self-regulation, we might say. So it involves kind of those two major aspects. Now, mindfulness is not about being calm. It isn't something that we're trying to use as a behavior intervention to get kids to act differently. Um, and it definitely is not what some people think about as the absence of thought. It'd be impossible just to get rid of all the thoughts that we have in our head, right? Like the old joke about, don't think about a pink elephant, and of course the first thing you think about is a pink elephant. So it isn't about absence of thought. It's much more about working with those thoughts. It's about inviting them in and saying, boy, what's going on here? It's definitely not about discipline. That's not what we're interested in, when we're talking about this. It's not a regulation. It isn't meant to be some sort of behavior plan. It's not a silver bullet. We don't think of this as like the one thing that's going to change, our schools or a classroom just dramatically. But I think that there are things that will definitely show that I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And when we talk about mindfulness, we're not talking about anything religious. The Mindful Schools program is really much more aimed at a secular approach. We talk about some universal ideas like kindness or patience, and our emotions and recognizing what our emotions are. It's not anything that's prescriptive. It's not, trying to tell people, here are certain guidelines or ethics or ways of being. It's definitely much more of a secular kind of program. And mindfulness, we tend to think of like mind and brain, but there is obviously heartfulness or compassion or kindness or, an emotional aspect that goes along with this. So, these two things kind of go hand in hand. You couldn't kind of address one without addressing the other. Now, why practice mindfulness? Well, particularly when we're talking about schools, and everybody watching this video, and myself included, would be involved in school somehow. I think we probably understand what schools are like today. You know, there seems to be like a low grade kind of stress, maybe medium grade kind of stress that happens just about every school day. And it can be for all kinds. For teachers, we know we've got lots of things that are going on. As educators, we have lots of things that we're worried about throughout the day and making sure everybody's getting what they need and, all the plans we had made and how are we going to get those things accomplished. And then dealing with the little things that kind of pop up that we weren't expecting. And of course, for students, the learning process itself can be rather stressful. They're navigating peer relationships as well at the same time. So those things can be kind of stressful. There are lots of things outside of school that they bring with them that could be stressful. So, it's a good idea that we might consider how could mindfulness maybe help us to address some of those issues that we're finding. And it seems more and more, even just like modern day life sometimes is kind of stressful. We always kind of seem to be in a rush. So, hopefully mindfulness is a way of addressing these kinds of problems. And of course, not only, can these mindfulness practices help, but we definitely should. First, there's been some research done that kind of shows that there's a link between teacher stress and student stress. And the Time magazine article mentioned that, stress is contagious. And, maybe we felt that before, that oftentimes, even when we're around people who are stressed, we ourselves tend to become stressed. And one of the other things that sometimes the research has shown is that, our parasympathetic system, our stress and our unstressed kind of system, if you will, really takes a long time to develop. And, that unstressing system really doesn't come into full development until in the early 20s in life. So from students, kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, they're still developing that kind of unstressing system to which mindfulness can play kind of a role. So that's something that we as educators who see students as they're beginning to develop that, we can help them strengthen that behavior, as they're developing throughout their entire school course there. So mindfulness definitely is something that can be a practice that is going to be beneficial for students, not just now, but also in the long run. This graphic is one of my favorites when it kind of comes to mindfulness, and I think it helps to explain a lot. If we're in a state where we're not being very mindful, oftentimes there's something that happens, some sort of stimulus, and we have a reaction. It's just a gut reaction, a very impulsive kind of response. And I see this a lot as a teacher, and probably as parents. You might have even seen this, that something happens and boom, there's just an immediate reaction. What we're hoping is with mindfulness to create a pause. And sure, there's always going to be some stimulus. Something happens to us that we weren't expecting. But before we make that impulsive response, which we might regret later, mindfulness allows us to stop for a moment, to really assess what's going on, and then to choose a more thoughtful response. That way we won't regret whatever kind of response it is that we're going to give next. So it begins to be a very thoughtful kind of way of reacting to the things that are occurring. So now I'd like to give you a little bit of a history about mindfulness, where it's come from, why are we hearing a lot about mindfulness in schools maybe right now. First, it's interesting to note that it's been over 35 years that mindfulness-based interventions have been used. And there have been research projects that have supported the use of mindfulness-based interventions. And I'll talk a little bit about those now. The first place where we began to see these was in the healthcare system. John Kabat-Zinn, again, a name to know at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, began working with patients who had chronic pain. And these were patients who weren't responding to some of the typical kinds of medical interventions that had happened. So he developed a mindfulness-based stress reduction program that began to use some mindfulness practices like stretching, meditation, yoga, to address some of those symptoms that they were having. And it was met with a lot of success. And in fact, this program, that mindfulness-based stress reduction program, has been in effect ever since it first began. And it's been very successful. It tends to kind of function as the operationalization of mindfulness practices even today. So it kind of set the standard, if you will. After there was so much success in treating patients' physical symptoms with mindfulness interventions, then people began to wonder, would that help people with mental health concerns such as depression or anxiety? And so many of the studies then began to explore this. And a new program was kind of developed called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or dialectical behavior therapy. The original programs thus far were really aimed at adults. But it wasn't long before they began to wonder, after seeing so much success with adults, would this work with adolescents? So it was really in this field then that youth services began to draw on this and say, well, if it was so successful with adults, let's try some of these mindfulness-based interventions with youth. So, of course, then it wasn't long before education became a focus of mindfulness-based interventions. Some of the earliest ones were of teachers who had backgrounds in that mindfulness-based stress reduction programs and seen its success. And then, by the early 2000s or mid 2000s there, you begin to see mindfulness programs really directly aimed at schools and in an education setting, teaching mindfulness to teachers as well as beginning to adopt that directly with students. And in fact, they found a lot of success even just with the teachers having mindfulness training. The students actually began to see a lot of benefits as a result of that training. So I'll continue on, and I won't go too long on some of the research. I'll share just a glimpse, a quick little snapshot of some of the findings of research. There's a bibliography at the end, obviously, you could take a look at, and I'll talk a little bit about the neuroscience. So you could look for the bibliography at the end if you want to find some specific data to use. But just to give you an idea of some of the effects that they've seen. Again, the first one there from the Center of Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts, the John Kabat-Zinn, again, they found that it definitely helped out with physical and psychological symptoms that those patients with chronic pain had had. It did reduce their pain levels. It allowed them to relax. It improved their self-esteem. The quality of life was a lot better, and they were more able to cope with stressful situations. And again, that shift over into looking at how would this impact adolescents if they were successful with adults? Same thing. That mindfulness-based stress reduction study with young adults found that there was an 80% reversal in the DSM diagnoses: depression, stress, anxiety, their level of well-being. All of these things improved actually with mindfulness-based interventions. And it goes from adolescents even down into the younger children. Sometimes studies focus primarily on students with ADHD, but again, attention was one aspect of improvement. The Mindful Schools program that I mentioned earlier, I took courses with. They partnered with the University of California, Davis. Their kind of groundbreaking work in the Oakland City schools was really important. And again, they found that working with those students in a classroom setting, that they were improved in their paying of attention and their self-care and participation and how they cared for others, showing care for others. So a lot of these just kind of give you a quick glimpse of the benefits, you might say, that you could derive, what research has kind of shown. And of course, there is ongoing research there. The field of research in mindfulness is growing, every year. So there are even more studies to come. Now, in terms of neuroscience, again, it's not my area of expertise, but sometimes it's very helpful to kind of understand exactly what's going on, how we might be functioning. And of course, like, as children are developing, different parts of their brain are developing at different times. So maybe this will be just at least a pretty good overview to kind of get you thinking about how mindfulness kind of plays a role into how our brain is actually operating. So the first area of the brain we'll talk about is the prefrontal cortex. It's the area kind of right behind your forehead, and this is the area of the brain that is responsible for our executive functioning. And this gets to be what we might call some of our higher level functioning. And again, we've talked about mindfulness as being aimed at helping ourselves pay attention more. That's this area of the brain, as well as regulating our emotions and controlling our impulses. That's our area of the brain right here. So definitely mindfulness is aimed at helping students begin to develop this area of their brain. Another area we'd be interested in as educators is the hippocampus. When I walk into class and I ask students to recall what they had learned in class yesterday and to build on the knowledge that they had before, they're using their hippocampus. It's responsible for memory, for storing information, for recalling all of that information. Now, the last area of the brain I'll talk about is the amygdala. And this is the area of the brain that begins to kind of take over when we experience a lot of strong emotions. And this is that area of the brain that becomes very active when we slip into that flight, fight, or freeze mode. So when students are stressed, when you and I are stressed, it's our amygdala that really begins to take over. Now, what's kind of important to recognize is that when the amygdala is really active, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are not going to be as active. And, it has all sorts of other physiological impacts that kind of go on. But, now it becomes very difficult for students to learn if they're in this mode, and the amygdala is the part of the brain that's really active. They're going to be much more concerned about like survival than they're going to be about, learning new things or taking risks as a learner. And definitely recalling even just what they learned the other day. They're not going to be able to store new information if they're going to be in this kind of mode. Now, one thing that's really interesting to note about the amygdala is that while the amygdala might be activated and experience a lot of strong emotions, we can actually begin to deactivate the amygdala just simply by naming the kind of emotion that we're having. So when we begin to identify, and mindfulness practices are really all about this, to be experiencing in the moment, like, boy, what am I really feeling? When we begin to just name what that feeling is, then we're shifting over into using the prefrontal cortex. Now we begin to regulate those emotions. It isn't about diminishing the emotions per se, but it's about beginning to recognize what is going on and then shifting over so we can make that thoughtful response. We need the prefrontal cortex in order to do that. We're going to react very impulsively if we're stuck in using our amygdala in that flight, fright, or freeze mode. Let's take a moment just to have a mindfulness experience. It's kind of nice just to experience what it might be like. So I love this graphic because I think that this is really truly what's kind of going on for most of us. We got a lot of stuff that's kind of going on, and that's okay. Oftentimes we're just kind of going with it. We're just being very impulsive. We're just kind of going with whatever might be happening. So it's nice to maybe sometimes take that pause, a little mindfulness break, and just kind of check in. Use it as a chance to maybe relax, calm down. It isn't like we have to do anything to get rid of emotions. It's just a way of kind of really checking in and just kind of seeing where we're at. So first, we want to assume a mindful posture, and that's just a good, straight spine. You don't have to be sitting on the floor cross-legged or anything like that. You could just be sitting in a chair, just kind of get into a good, comfortable position, but sometimes where you're active, not slouching down. One of the things that you might choose to focus on, again, we're developing concentration. So you might choose to focus on your breath. And that's one kind of concentrative practice in mindfulness that you might choose to do. And sometimes, you might really zoom in on where you feel your breath. It might be up at your nose, feeling it come in through your nose. It might be in your chest, it might be down lower, breathing deeply in your abdomen. So, you might take a moment just to kind of really feel where you might be breathing. And again, you're breathing all the time, but you probably haven't paid attention to it. Now's the time just to kind of check in with that. Just really kind of be for a second. Let your mind kind of still for a second. You know, it's okay. Whatever thoughts might come up, just gonna say, yeah, that's what I was thinking about. That's totally fine. Then maybe just kind of come back to your breath for a moment. So yeah, I'm going to go back to the breathing thing and let me feel that breath one more time. So we'll take just maybe just a minute to go ahead and focus just wherever you might be. Nice, good, straight posture. Just breathe a little bit and focus on that. Okay. You can open your eyes if you close your eyes. How'd that feel? Hope that was a nice break for you. So let me just conclude by talking a little bit about the curriculum that I'm hoping to use in school. The curriculum comes, again, from the Mindfulness Schools program. They've developed these 15-minute lessons that are designed to be done once a week or twice a week. Sometimes you come back and kind of check in. They've got about 16 weeks worth of lessons or a few additional ones. There have been some other examples of activities that I'd like to pull in as well. And again, the program is really aimed at being secular. It's not religious. It isn't like there's any particular, special practice or ethics or things like that outside of, what is just a traditional mainstream secular kind of approach. And really, they're more about life skills. I'll joke with the kids and say, you get people all the time telling you to pay attention or, man, you got to concentrate when you're playing sports or playing an instrument or things like that. And yet, we don't do a whole lot to tell students like how to pay attention. And we don't do a lot of practicing of paying attention. And might tell them, oh, calm down, it's not that big a deal. But we don't talk about how to tune into our emotions and maybe shift over into a calmer state of reacting to things. So, hopefully those are just really good life skills that are beneficial to everybody, but particular to kids in a school setting. And of course, if you have any questions about the program whatsoever, I'm always happy to answer those. I greatly thank you for watching the video today. There's my contact information if you need anything there. And again, to follow, I'll click through. There's a bibliography of more research in case you want other resources. But again, I'm always happy to talk with you. Thanks for joining me today. Look forward to talking to you again.